Girl, you are not a duchess. You are a mistake my son made in a weak season.
The blow came before the candles had even finished flickering. Crack. Dowager Duchess Varvara Ashveil struck her again, open palm, then knuckle. Then the cold brass edge of her ring dragging slowly across Thessaly's cheek. As though she were not a woman, as though she were not with child, as though she were simply a stain on a gown that refused to lift. Thessaly did not scream. She pressed both hands to her swollen belly, breathed once through toes, and stared at the floor, at the single drop of blood that had fallen from her lip and bloomed like a red rose on the white marble. "Look at me when I speak to you, girl," Varva said, voice low and silk-wrapped and crueler for it. "You are not a duchess. You are a mistake my son made in a weak season." And still, Thessaly said nothing. She simply smiled, a small thing. Barely there. The kind of smile that does not belong on the face of a woman who is losing, but on the face of a woman who has already decided. What had she decided? If you are new here, welcome. Subscribe, ring that bell, and do not go anywhere, because what this woman did next shook a house that had stood for 200 years. Thessaly had not always been a woman who smiled at dangerous things. There was a time, not so long ago, when she had been soft in the way that young women raised in quiet houses tend to be soft. She had laughed too easily, and spoken too freely, and worn her feelings on the outside of her face where anyone who looked could read them. Her father had called it her greatest charm. Her grandmother had called it her greatest vulnerability. She understood now which one of them had loved her more honestly. She had married Calum Ashvail on a cold November morning, with ice on the chapel steps and roses that had been cut too early and were already beginning to brown at the edges. She had told herself it was beautiful anyway. She had been good at that then, finding beauty in things that were already dying. Calum was not a cruel man. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the private spaces of her own mind, where she was allowed to be honest. He was not cruel. He was simply absent, in the way that some men are absent, even when they are standing directly in front of you. He had looked at her on their wedding day, with something that might have been warmth, or might have been relief. And she had chosen to call it love because she was 22, and it was her wedding day. And some choices you make not because they are true, but because you need them to be. He had left for London 11 days after the wedding. Varvara had watched the carriage pull away from the upper window, and then turned to Thessaly with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to say something, and is now finally permitted to say it. She had said nothing. She had only looked, and somehow that had been worse. The house was large in the way that old houses built by proud men tend to be large, full of rooms that no one used, and corridors that seemed to stretch longer at night than they did in the day. Thessaly had tried to learn it in those first weeks, walking the halls in the mornings, with her hand trailing along the wall, memorizing which floorboards creaked, and which doors stuck, and where the light came through the windows in the late afternoon, and turned the dust in the air to something almost golden. She had been trying to make it hers. She understood now that Varvara had watched her do this, the way a woman watches someone rearrange furniture in a room they will soon be asked to leave. The staff were kind to her, in the careful sideways manner of people who are kind when no one important is watching. A young housemaid named Petra, no older than 17, with red hands and an honest face, had once pressed a small bundle of dried lavender into Thessaly's palm in the corridor outside the kitchen, and said nothing, only looked at the bruise forming along Thessaly's jaw, with eyes that said everything. Thessaly had closed her fingers around the lavender, and walked away because crying in corridors was something she could not afford. There was also Mr. Rendell, the elderly groundskeeper, who tended the walled garden at the east side of the house, with the devotion of a man who had decided long ago that plants were more trustworthy than people. He had a wall of herbs along the south-facing stone, planted in careful rows, labelled in his small, cramped handwriting on wooden stakes pushed into the soil. He did not speak much, but he always unlocked the garden gate when he heard Thessaly coming. She had begun going there every morning, not for the lavender or the rosemary or the mint that pressed its sharp, clean smell into the cold air. She went because the garden was the one place in the Ashveil estate where Varvara did not follow. Whether it was the cold or the mud or simply the absence of an audience, Thessaly did not know. But for those 30 minutes each morning, she could breathe without measuring it. She would press her hands against her stomach and feel the child move and remind herself what she was doing this for. The child was everything. The child was the only sentence in this story that she absolutely needed to end well. It was on a Tuesday morning in the garden that Mr. Rendell had paused over a small dark-leafed plant near the far wall, and said, without looking up from the soil, that he had not planted that one, that it had simply appeared, that he did not know its name, but that his grandmother had grown the same plant once, and had kept it well away from the kitchen. He had not said anything else. Thessaly's had crouched down and looked at it for a long time. The leaves were smooth and deep green and shaped like small hands. She did not touch it. She only looked. That evening she had opened her journal and written 3 words. Then she had pressed the pen down so hard that the nib had bled through to the page beneath. She closed the journal. She thought about Calum, somewhere in London, attending dinners and debates, and not once wondering whether his wife had eaten that day, or whether his mother's rings had left marks again. She thought about the child. She thought about the plant near the far wall with its small hands and its quiet presence, and the fact that it had appeared on its own, in a garden it had not been invited into, and had simply begun to grow. And she thought that perhaps she understood something about that. Something was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. A pressure behind the eyes, a stillness in the air that is not peace, but the thing that precedes the end of peace. Varvara had called her a mistake. Thessaly was beginning to think that was exactly what she wanted her to believe. It happened on a Wednesday. Thessaly would remember that detail for the rest of her life. The way Wednesday felt like an ordinary word, a plain and unremarkable day wedged between the weight of the week, and how something that ordinary had held inside it the moment that changed everything. She had come down to breakfast early. The morning was grey, and the fire in the dining room had not yet been properly built up, and she had sat at the far end of the long table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and her journal open, beside her plate, reading back what she had written the night before. She had not heard Varvara come in. That was the thing about Varvara. For a large woman with a heavy silk gown and rings on every finger, she moved like something that did not want to be heard until it was too late. The journal was out of Thessaly's hands before she could close it. She stood up from the chair so fast that the tea spilled across the white tablecloth and spread in a wide pale stain, and she reached for the journal, but Varvara had already stepped back with it, pressed against her chest, and was reading, eyes moving slowly down the open page, with the particular expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time, and is now being given the satisfaction of being right. Thessaly said her name, once, firmly. Varvara looked up. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the grounds were still, and the sky was the colour of old pewter, and somewhere far off a door was closing somewhere in the house, that soft and distant sound of a world that did not know what was happening in this room. Varvara read the 3 words Thessaly had written. She read them again. Then she set the journal down on the table, very carefully, the way you set down something you want to demonstrate you are not afraid of. And she looked at Thessaly with an expression that was not anger. It was something colder than anger. Anger has heat in it. This had none, she said quietly. That a woman who writes such things in a house that belongs to her betters is a woman who has forgotten what she is. Thessaly said she had forgotten nothing. That was the moment it shifted. Varvara crossed the room in 3 steps, and the blow came not from the open hand this time, but from the closed one, and it caught Thessaly across the left side of her face, with enough force that she stumbled sideways into the edge of the table, and went down on one knee with her arm braced against the wood, and her ears ringing, and the room tilting badly to one side. She felt the child move, a hard, frightened kick, low and sharp, and the fear that came with it was different from any fear she had felt before. It was not fear for herself. It dropped through her like cold water, fast and total, and she pressed her palm flat against her stomach, and breathed and breathed and breathed until the room stopped moving. Varvara stood over her. She said that if Thessaly ever wrote anything like that again, if she ever entertained any thought like that again, she would make sure that Calum knew exactly what kind of woman he had married. She would make sure everyone knew. She would dismantle Thessaly's name so thoroughly that the child would spend its entire life trying to carry what remained of it. Then she picked up the journal. She walked to the fireplace and she placed it in the grate, and she waited until the pages caught, and then she turned around and left the room. Thessaly stayed where she was on the floor for a long time after that. She was not crying. She was doing something quieter than crying, something that had no good name for it, sitting with her back against the table, and her hand on her stomach, and her eyes fixed on the small curling remains of her journal going black, and then grey, and then nothing in the grate. Petra found her there 20 minutes later and said nothing, only crouched down beside her and pressed a cold cloth against the side of her face and held it there without being asked. Thessaly looked at the girl and said, very evenly, that she needed to know if anyone in this house had written to the Duke recently. Not the formal household correspondence. Personal letters. Letters from his mother. Petra looked at the floor. That was answer enough. Calum arrived home 3 days later. Thessaly had spent those 3 days deciding what she would say and how she would say it, and in what order the words needed to come so that they would land the way. Truth is supposed to land clean and undeniable. She had rehearsed it in the garden with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath visible in the cold air, saying it quietly to herself, watching how the sentence sat when she pulled it out into the open. She had been ready. He had come into the sitting room where she was waiting, and he had looked at her, with something careful and controlled in his face that she had not seen before, and before she could speak he had said, gently, in the tone of a man who has already been given a version of events and has spent a long journey home deciding what to do with them, that his mother had written to him. The world narrowed. He said that she had expressed concern, that she had described Thessaly as agitated, unpredictable, that there had apparently been an episode at breakfast that had unsettled the household. He said all of this carefully, like a man trying not to start a fire while holding a lit match, and he watched her face the entire time. Thessaly did not speak for a moment. She looked at her husband, this quiet and absent man she had chosen to call love, because she had needed something to call it, and she understood with a clarity that arrived the way the worst truths always arrive, all at once and without warning, that there was no version of what she said in this room tonight, that Varvara had not already preceded. Whatever she told him, Varvara had told him first. Whatever she showed him, bruise or journal, or the fear she had felt on the floor of the dining room, with the child kicking hard against her ribs, there was already a story in his head that had been written by someone else and handed to him as the truth. She was alone, not in the ordinary way that people are alone when there is no one in the room. In the deeper way, the kind that settles into the bones and says, quietly but without any cruelty, that no one is coming, that whatever happens next is entirely yours to carry. She smiled at her husband, that small quiet smile. She told him she was glad he was home. She told him she had not been sleeping well, that the pregnancy made rest difficult, that she hoped they might dine together that evening. He looked relieved. He reached across and touched her hand briefly and said of course, and that he would speak to his mother about giving Thessaly more rest, and that things would settle. She nodded. After he left the room, she sat for a long time with her hands still in her lap. She thought about the plant near the far wall of the garden. She thought about her grandmother's voice. She thought about how a woman who has been left completely alone by everyone who was supposed to stand beside her is also a woman who has nothing left to lose. That thought did not frighten her. That was the part that should have frightened her. Thessaly began to change in small ways that noticed at first. She started waking before dawn, not because sleep would not come, though that was also true, but because the early hours before the house stirred belonged to no one yet, and she had decided she needed time that belonged to no one but her. She would sit at the window of her room in the dark, with her knees drawn up as far as her stomach would allow, and she would think, carefully and without sentiment, about everything she knew and everything she still needed to learn. She thought about her grandmother often in those hours, a small, iron-backed woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a war and a season so cold it had killed the livestock and half the village, and had still managed to keep a garden. She had not been a soft woman. She had not raised Thessaly to be a soft woman either. Thessaly understood now, in a way she had not understood at 12 or 18, or even on her wedding morning, that the lavender and the rosemary and the careful rows of herbs had not only been about beauty or medicine or the pleasure of a well-kept garden. They had been about knowledge, the particular kind of knowledge that women in difficult houses have always needed and have rarely been permitted to say they needed. She began spending more time with Mr. Rendell, not in a way that anyone would remark on. She was careful about that now, careful in a way she had not been before, thinking 3 steps ahead of every action, the way her grandmother had once told her chess required you to think. She would come to the garden in the mornings, as she always had, and she would ask questions that sounded like the ordinary questions of a woman with time on her hands and an interest in growing things. What was the difference between this leaf and that one? Why did some plants draw insects and others repel them? What made something medicinal and what made something dangerous? And was there always a clear line between the two? Mr. Rendell was not a man who asked why someone wanted to know something. He simply answered. She had always liked that about him. The dark-leafed plant near the far wall was still there. He had not removed it. She had not asked him to. They did not speak about it directly, but sometimes she would stand near it at the end of her morning walk and look at it, and he would say something general and informative about the plant nearby. Not that one specifically, never that one specifically, and she would listen and file it away in the place inside her that was becoming very organized and very quiet. Petra brought her things without being asked. A book from the house library that had been sitting spine inward on a lower shelf, as though someone had once tried to hide it in plain sight. A small glass bottle of something that smelled of nothing, but that Petra said her own mother had used before saying nothing further, and taking the washing and leaving the room. Thessaly did not ask questions. She simply received what was offered, and was grateful in the way of someone who understands that gratitude in this house needed to be private. She was not without setbacks. Varvara had become watchful in a way she had not been before. The burning of the journal had satisfied something in her, but it had also sharpened her attention. And Thessaly felt it in the way you feel eyes on your back, in a room where you cannot turn around to confirm them. Varvara began appearing in the garden, on mornings she had never appeared before. She did not garden, she did not walk. She simply stood on the far end of the gravel path, near the iron bench, with her hands folded, and watched Thessaly move between the beds, with an expression that Thessaly had learned to translate by now. It was the expression of a woman, testing the strength of something, before deciding how to break it. There was a morning when Thessaly came too close to the far wall, and Varvara had crossed the garden in a way that was too purposeful to pretend was casual, and had taken Thessaly's arm above the elbow and said, very quietly, that a woman in her condition ought to be more careful about which plants she handled, that some things in old gardens were not meant to be touched by delicate hands, that accidents happened even when no one intended them. She had held Thessaly's arm for slightly too long before releasing it. Thessaly had looked at the fingers releasing her arm and thought, with a precision that surprised even herself, that she was no longer afraid of this woman. She was something else now. She was paying attention. Calum had slipped back into his usual pattern of absence within a week of returning, pulled by obligations he described in vague and important-sounding terms that Thessaly had stopped really listening to. He would sit across from her at dinner and speak about Parliament and matters of the estate, and she would respond appropriately and pass the bread and ask the kind of quiet questions that made a man feel heard without requiring him to actually say anything. She had become very good at this. It cost her almost nothing now. What cost her was watching him with his mother, the softness that came into his face when Varvara spoke to him, the way he laughed at things she said, that particular laugh of a man who has been loving someone his entire life and does not know how to revise that love, even when revision is long overdue. He was not a fool. She did not think he was a fool. He was something more difficult than a fool. He was a man who needed his mother to be what he had always believed she was, and the need was so deep and so old that no bruise she could show him, no truth she could arrange into words, would reach. She had tried once more, 2 weeks after his return, on an evening when the fire was warm and he seemed settled, and she had thought briefly that the moment was right. She had said, simply, that she was frightened in this house, that she did not feel safe, that she needed him to understand this, even if he could not understand the full shape of it yet. He had looked at her with that careful, managed expression, and said that pregnancy was known to create anxiety, that his mother had mentioned as much, that perhaps Dr. Havelock ought to come out from the village and have a look at her. She had not said anything else. Dr. Havelock did come a week later. He was a thin, pleasant man of about 60, with a very steady voice, and the particular manner of a physician who has spent his career being kind to women in houses. He was not permitted to fully understand. He had examined her and said the child was progressing well, and asked if she had been sleeping, and she had said yes, adequately, and he had nodded and packed his bag, and she had walked him to the door, herself, because she wanted a moment without Varvara in the room. At the door he had paused and turned back and looked at her face, and then at her wrist where the sleeve had shifted, and said, quietly, that if anything was causing her distress she ought not to keep it entirely to herself, that there were people in the village who were not connected to the house, and who might be of help. He said it as though he were speaking generally, as though it were a simple courtesy he offered to all his patients. She had looked at him. He had looked at her. Then he had put on his hat and walked down to his carriage, and she had watched him go and thought that perhaps she had one more person in the world than she had believed this morning. That evening Varvara came to her room. She did not knock. She opened the door and stood in the frame and looked at Thessaly sitting at the window and said that she hoped the doctor's visit had been reassuring, that it was important for a woman in Thessaly's position, in this house, to be seen to be well. That perception, in the world they lived in, was not something Thessaly could afford to be careless about. Then she said that Calum had mentioned he would be returning to London by the end of the week. Then she left. Thessaly sat with the dark outside the window, and the fire burning low, and her hand flat on her stomach, and she felt the child shift and settle, and she thought about everything she had gathered in these slow and careful weeks, the knowledge, the people, the quiet and terrible clarity of a woman who has been underestimated for long enough that she has stopped finding it insulting and started finding it useful. She was not the woman who had arrived in a hired carriage with her own trunk, and hope like a bruise already forming. She was something that woman had been becoming all along, without knowing it, and she was almost ready. Calum left on a Friday morning, and the house changed within the hour. Thessaly felt it, the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm, a subtle and total shift in the atmosphere, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for the carriage wheels to clear the gate before exhaling into their true shape. She stood at the upstairs window and watched the road long after the carriage had disappeared, and then she turned and looked at the room around her, and understood that whatever happened from this point forward would happen, without witness and without rescue, and entirely on her own terms. She had known this moment was coming. She had been preparing for it in the way of someone who has a great deal of time to think, and very little else they are permitted to do with their hands. It came sooner than she expected. That same evening, before the dinner hour, Varvara came to her room, not to the door, into the room. The door opened without a knock and without apology, and Varvara crossed the floor with that silent, deliberate movement of hers, and stood in the centre of the room, and looked at Thessaly sitting at the small writing desk with a book open in front of her that she had not been reading, and said that needed to speak plainly now that her son was gone. Thessaly closed the book and folded her hands on top of it and waited. Varvara said that she had been patient. She said this with complete seriousness, as though patience were the word that accurately described what the last several months had been. She said that she had given Thessaly time to understand her position in this house, and that Thessaly had repeatedly demonstrated she was unwilling to accept it. She said that a woman who arrived with nothing and married above herself owed a particular kind of gratitude, and that Thessaly had shown none of it. Then she said the child. She said it the way you say a word that you have been keeping in reserve, knowing exactly what it will do when you finally put it down on the table between two people. She said that when the child was born, if it was a son, which it would need to be to matter, there would be decisions made about its upbringing and its influences that would not be left to Thessaly. That women of unstable temperament, women with histories of agitation and delusion, women who wrote dangerous things in journals that needed to be destroyed, were not women who were trusted with the shaping of a future duke. Thessaly looked at her. She said, in a voice she had not used before in this house, a voice with no apology in it and no attempt at softness, that she understood. Varvara seemed to take this as surrender. The expression on her face settled into something satisfied, and she stepped forward and reached out and put her hand under Thessaly's chin, the way you tilt up the face of a child you are about to correct, and she said that good. Then they understood each other. What happened next happened very fast. Varvara's free hand came across her face, harder than it had ever come before, and Thessaly's head snapped to the side, and the corner of her vision went white, and she felt herself slide from the chair and land hard on both knees on the floor, and the pain from the fall drove upward through her entire body, and the child moved, a sharp and desperate lurching movement, and she heard herself make a sound she had not meant to make, involuntary and animal and raw. She pressed both palms flat on the floor. She breathed. She did not look up. Varvara said something above her. She could hear the words, but they had gone to a strange distance, as though she were hearing them from the bottom of a well. Something about knowing her place. Something about this being mercy. Something about the child needing a grandmother, more than it needed the woman who had carried it. Thessaly looked at her own hands on the floor. She thought about the child. She thought about the plant near the far wall with its small dark hands. She thought about every morning she had sat with Mr. Rendell, and listened and learned and filed it away in the quiet, organized space inside her. She thought about the small glass bottle Petra had given her without explanation. She thought about Dr. Havelock at the door saying, there were people in the village, not connected to the house, who might be of help, and how she had gone to the village twice in the past 3 weeks, on the pretext of air and exercise, and who she had spoken to there, and what she had been given, and how, and in what measure. She thought about her grandmother's voice. A wise woman learns the shadow flowers. She got up from the floor without help and without hurry. And she stood and looked at Varvara and said, very quietly, that she would like to be alone now. Something in her voice made Varvara pause, only for a moment. But it was a pause. Then Varvara left. Thessaly stood in the centre of her room for a long time after the door closed. She pressed her hands to her stomach and felt the child move again, slower now, settling. She looked at the writing desk. She looked at the small locked drawer at the bottom of it, to which she had the only key. She made her decision without drama, without the shaking hands, and the pacing, and the anguished deliberation that she had always imagined such a decision would require. It arrived already made, as though it had been made weeks ago by some other part of her that had been waiting for the rest of her to catch up. She unlocked the drawer. The following morning she rose early as always. She went to the kitchen while Petra was the only one present, and she helped as she had begun to help on quiet mornings, with the preparation of the household's morning tray. Her presence in the kitchen had become unremarkable. She had made it unremarkable deliberately, over weeks, with patience and pleasantness, and the particular invisibility of a woman whom everyone has collectively decided is harmless. Petra did not look at her. Thessaly did not look at Petra. The tray was prepared, and Thessaly carried it herself as far as the corridor outside, Varvara's sitting room, where Anfisa collected it as she always did. Only Anfisa was late this morning, and the tray sat on the hall table for 4 minutes while Thessaly stood nearby, with her hands folded and her face arranged into nothing at all. When Anfisa came, she took the tray without looking at Thessaly and disappeared through the door. Thessaly went to the garden. She stood at the far wall beside the dark-leafed plant, and she put her hands in her coat pockets, and she breathed the cold morning air, and she looked at the pale winter sky, and she thought about nothing, deliberately nothing. The skill of thinking about nothing was one she had been practicing for months, and she was very good at it now. An hour later she heard it, not screaming, something worse than screaming, a sound that moved through the house like a shock wave, muffled by walls and corridors, and distant but unmistakable in its nature, the sound of something going terribly and irreversibly wrong, then running feet on stone, then a door, then a voice, Anfisa's voice, high and broken, and calling for someone, calling for anyone. Thessaly did not move. She stood with her hands in her pockets and the cold air on her face, and she felt the child move, a slow and steady turning, something that felt almost like settling, like arriving somewhere. She thought about who she had been when she came to this house. The woman with the hired courage and the borrowed hope and the face that wore everything on its outside where anyone could read it. She thought about what that woman had believed about the world, that goodness was rewarded, and endurance was enough, and that the people who were supposed to protect you would protect you if you only waited long enough. She did not hate that woman. She simply understood that she was gone. Petra appeared at the garden gate, breathless, her face the colour of paper, and she looked at Thessaly, and Thessaly looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Thessaly said calmly that she should go and send for Dr. Havelock. Petra turned and ran. Thessaly looked at the dark-leaf plant one last time. She had never touched it. She wanted to be clear about that, in the precise and careful record of her own memory. She had never touched it. She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her the garden was still. The plant near the far wall sat quiet in the pale morning light, its small dark leaves folded slightly inward, as though they too were keeping something, and the house of Ashveil waited to see what it had become. Dr. Havelock arrived within the hour. Thessaly sat in the front parlour while he worked, and listened to the sounds of the house rearranging itself around the fact of what had happened. Feet on stairs, voices in corridors dropping to registers they were not normally kept at, Anfisa somewhere above, making a sound that was not quite weeping. something older and more hollow than weeping, the ordinary sounds of a household discovering that the person at its centre had been removed. Varvara Celestine Ashveil died before noon. Dr. Havelock came down and found Thessaly where she had not moved, and told her in his steady, careful voice that the dowager had passed, and that in his assessment it appeared to be a sudden and severe episode of the heart, which had been of concern to him for some time, given her constitution and her temperament. He said this looking at Thessaly directly. She looked back at him directly. Neither of them said anything further about it. He asked if she was well, if the child was well. She said yes to both. He nodded and put on his hat and said he would send word to the Duke, and that she should rest, and that he would return in 2 days to look in on her. She thanked him and watched him leave, and then she sat alone in the parlour for a long time in the silence that Varvara had left behind, which was, she noted with something she could not fully name, a different quality of silence than any the house had held before. Softer, less watched. She put her hand on her stomach and breathed. Calum arrived home 2 days later. He came in through the front door with his coat still on, and his face carrying the particular rawness of a man who has received terrible news at a distance, and spent the entire journey home holding it together because there was nothing else to do with it until he arrived. He stood in the entrance hall and looked at Thessaly, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he walked to her and put his arms around her and held on. She let him. She stood in his arms and felt his grief pressing against her, and she thought about how grief was a simple and honest thing, how it did not require explanation or justification, how even she could not be unmoved by the sight of a person losing someone they had loved without condition, however much that love had cost them both. She held him back. She did not cry. There was a brief inquiry, a formality, the local magistrate and 2 men from the county, who asked careful questions and received careful answers, and turned over nothing of consequence, because there was nothing on the surface that required turning. Dr. Havelock gave his account in the measured and authoritative tones of a man of medicine, whose word carried weight in this part of the country. The household staff gave their accounts. Petra was asked if she had noticed anything unusual, and said no in a voice that did not waver. Thessaly was asked if she had been with the dowager that morning. She said she had been in the garden. That was true. She had been in the garden. The inquiry concluded within a week. Natural causes. The dowager had been a woman of strong will and considerable strain, which in the view of the attending physician placed significant burden on the heart over time. There was nothing further to investigate. The house moved into mourning. It was during the mourning period, in the 3rd week, that Calum found the letters. He had been going through his mother's correspondence as her son and the executor of her estate, and he found them in the locked drawer of her writing desk, for which he had to send to her solicitor for the spare key. They were arranged in order of date. They went back further than he had known. Not just the ones she had sent to him during his absences, but the ones she had sent to others, the neighbouring families, the women of her social circle, the people who had been shaping their perception of Thessaly since before Thessaly had even arrived in this house. He read them all. He did not come to Thessaly's room that evening. He came the morning after, and he sat across from her at the small table by the window, and he looked at his hands for a long time before he looked at her. And when he did look at her, she saw something in his face that had not been there before, something that had the shape of a man who has been confronted with a version of events he had refused to see, and is now being made to sit with the full weight of his refusal. He said he was sorry. She looked at him. He said it again, differently. Not the apology of a man performing contrition, but the apology of a man who has genuinely understood something and does not know yet how to carry it. He said he should have seen it. He said she had tried to tell him, and he had not been willing to hear it, and he understood that there was no adequate accounting for that, and he was not going to insult her by pretending there was. She listened to all of it. Then she said that she accepted his apology. She said it plainly, without warmth or coldness, the way you say something that is true, but that exists at a distance from everything that was damaged. He heard the distance. She saw him hear it, and absorb it, and decide not to argue with it, because there was nothing to argue with. They sat together at that window for a while, and neither of them spoke, and outside the grounds were grey and bare, in the late autumn light, and the walled garden was visible from that angle, just the top of the stone wall and the empty branches of the trees above it. She did not look at the garden. The child came 6 weeks later, in the early morning, on a day when the frost had come in hard overnight and turned everything outside white and still. It was a boy. She held him for the first time in the grey winter light, and felt something move through her that had no name she could reach for, something that was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, something larger and more terrible and more sustaining than happiness. She had carried this child through everything, through the blows, and the silence, and the nights on the cold floor, and the long careful months of becoming someone she had never planned to become. And here he was, warm and furious, and entirely himself, with no knowledge of any of it. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. She thought about her grandmother. She named him Evren. It was a name from the old language, her grandmother's language, a name that meant the wide universe, the infinite everything. Calum had not heard it before. He had looked at her when she said it, and she had held his gaze, and he had said quietly that it was a good name. The house changed after that, in ways that were not dramatic but were felt. Anfisa left, which was expected. Several other members of staff chose not to renew their positions in the new year, which was also expected. What came instead were people Thessaly had chosen quietly, carefully, over the months that followed, people who came with recommendations from people she trusted, and who worked in the house with the particular ease of people who had not learned to be afraid in it yet. Petra stayed. She was promoted without ceremony, and accepted it the same way, without ceremony, and went on being exactly who she had always been, which was the most valuable thing Thessaly had ever been given in this house. Dr. Havelock continued to visit. He never said anything that was not strictly professional, neither did she, but there was something between them, a mutual and careful understanding of the kind that forms between two people who know the same true thing and have agreed, without words, to hold it very still. Calum did not become the husband she had once imagined him to be when she was young and choosing hope over honesty. That version had not survived this house. She did not grieve it as sharply as she once might have. What remained was something more complicated and more real. He looked at her differently now. He came home more often. He sat with Evren in the evenings, with a tenderness that she had not known he possessed. And she would watch them from across the room and feel something that was neither love nor the absence of love, but the quieter and more difficult thing that lives between them. She had not returned to be the woman she was before. She understood now that she had never been going to return to her. That woman had been given a house and a husband and a mother who was a wall with rings on her fingers, and she had endured and she had bent, and she had finally, quietly decided. And the deciding had cost her something that she could not recover and would not name, and carried always in the private space that belonged only to herself. But she was here. The child was here. The house was hers now, in every way that mattered. She stood at the window of her room on a cold, clear morning, with Evren asleep in the next room, and the grounds below her pale and still, and the walled garden visible at the east side of the house, the stone wall, the bare winter beds, and at the far end, though she could not see it from this distance, the dark-leafed plant that had grown without being invited. She did not smile. She simply looked, and she thought that she had learned what her grandmother had always meant her to learn. Not about plants, not about shadow and light and what grows in dark places. About herself, about how much a woman can become when everything else has been taken away and she is finally, completely, terribly free. Spring came slowly that year, the way spring comes after a long and heavy winter, reluctantly, in small offerings of light that appeared and disappeared before you could be certain of them. Thessaly noticed it first in the garden. She had gone back to the walled garden in February, the first time since that morning, and she had stood at the gate for a while before going in, not from fear. She was not afraid of gardens. She was simply in the habit, now, of pausing before she entered any space, of taking one breath and choosing who she was going to be on the other side of the threshold. It was a small ritual she had developed without planning to, and had decided to keep. She went in. The winter beds were bare and grey, and the stone walls still held the cold. Mr. Rendell was at the far end, with his back to her, turning soil with the quiet dedication of a man who understood that all gardens require renewal and ask nothing about what happened in them before. The plant near the far wall was gone. She did not ask him about it. He did not mention it. The space where it had been was clean-turned earth, ready for something else. And she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked away, and that was the end of it. Evren was 4 months old when Calum held him in the garden for the first time, sitting on the iron bench in the pale afternoon light, with the child against his chest, and an expression on his face that Thessaly had never seen on him before, and could not fully name. It was not happiness exactly. It was something more stripped than happiness, something that had had everything else removed from it, until only the essential thing remained. She had stood at the garden gate and watched them, and felt the bittersweet settle into her the way it always settled now, not arriving but simply present, the way a scar is present, something you stop, noticing until you catch it unexpectedly and remember all at once what it cost. She loved her son with a ferocity that was entirely uncomplicated. It was the only uncomplicated thing left in her life, and she was grateful for it every single day. Her marriage was not uncomplicated. Calum had not become someone different. He had become more honestly who he already was, which was at once more than she had been given before, and less than she had once hoped for. He was present more often. He looked at her when she spoke. He had stopped relaying anything to anyone before speaking to her first. These were not small things. She understood they were not small things, but they existed at a careful distance from everything that had come before them. And she did not know yet whether that distance would close, or whether it was simply the shape their life together had taken and would keep. Some evenings he would look at her across the dinner table with something in his face that was close to a question. He had never asked her, and she would look back at him, and the question would remain between them like a closed door that neither of them moved toward. She did not know what she would say if he ever opened it. She was not certain he would ever open it. In the village, she had become something that people referred to carefully, and with a certain quality of respect that had not been there before. She was the young Duchess, who had survived a difficult first year. The woman who had managed the household through a great loss, without collapsing under it. The one with the dark eyes and the quiet manner, who moved through the market on Thursday mornings with her son in her arms, and spoke to people without the inherited condescension that Varvara had worn, like a second skin. They did not know what she had done, or perhaps some of them suspected and had decided that suspicion was a private matter between a woman and her conscience, and not the business of the village. Either way, she was let alone. Petra brought her the letter on a Tuesday morning in March. It had come from the east, the handwriting on the outer cover, a style she did not recognize, the seal pressed with a crest she had never seen. She turned it over in her hands, and looked at it for a long time before she opened it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper written in Russian, formal and careful, from a man who identified himself as Varvara's younger brother, a count still living outside Petersburg, who had heard of his sister's death and wished to convey his condolences to the household. In the second paragraph, he wrote that he had always known his sister to be a woman of strong convictions and considerable force, and that he hoped the household had found her so. He wrote that their family had certain matters pertaining to Varvara's estate that would require correspondence in the coming months. He wrote that he looked forward to making the acquaintance of the Duchess Ashveil, of whom his sister had written a great deal. Thessaly read that sentence twice. Of whom his sister had written a great deal. She set the letter down on the desk. She looked out the window at the garden, at the pale March light beginning to find its colour again after the long grey months, at the stone wall and the new growth pressing upward in the beds, and gate that Mr. Rendell had left open at the east end, as he always did on clear mornings. She thought about letters, about what a woman like Varvara wrote, and to whom she wrote it, and how much she kept, and where she kept it, and whether a locked drawer in a writing desk was the only place she kept things. She thought about a man in Russia who had known his sister well. She picked up the letter again and read it a third time. Slowly, the way you read something that is offering you more than it appears to contain. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her own desk, the one with the key that only she had, and she turned the key and put it around her neck where she kept it always. She sat for a moment with her hand flat on the desk. She thought about everything she had survived to sit, in this chair, in this room, in this house, that was hers now, in every way that could be measured, and in several ways that could not. She thought about the woman who had arrived in a hired carriage, and folded herself smaller and smaller, and believed that endurance was the same thing as safety, and she thought about what she knew now that that woman did not. That safety is never given, that some things you must choose for yourself, in the dark, with no one watching, and carry the weight of the choosing every day afterward. She was still carrying it. She expected she always would be. Outside the window, Evren was asleep in the garden, in Petra's arms in the pale spring light, his small face turned up toward the sky with the absolute trust of someone who has never had a reason not to trust it. She watched him for a long time. That was enough. That had always been what it was for. If you have stayed this far, you already know that this story is not a simple one. It was never meant to be. It was meant to ask you something quiet and uncomfortable and worth sitting with. How much is a woman allowed to survive before survival becomes something else? What do we call it when the only person who protects a child is the child's own mother, and the only tools she has are the ones no one gave her? If this story found something in you, if Thessaly found something in you, then you already know the answer, even if you cannot say it out loud yet. Come back for Chapter 2. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because the Count from St. Petersburg is coming, and Thessaly Ashveil has never been less afraid in her life.